Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Daniel Tutt. I'm with Unity Productions Foundation. Very happy to welcome everyone. We have a wonderful and inspiring event in order for this evening entitled Malcolm Today, Malcolm X and the Movement for Black Lives. Unity Productions has been creating webinars for the past 2 or 3 months. And we invite all of you to check these out on our homepage at upf.tv/enrichment. Tonight's event, we have probably one of our most high profile, most exciting and most timely conversations in order for you. What we wanted to do was bring together community leaders from the Muslim American community, scholars, biographers of Malcolm, and really take a look at the legacy of Malcolm for this moment. This is a moment of profound justice and questions of social justice, of racial justice. The movement for Black Lives has captured the nation. And what is the legacy of Malcolm? What would Malcolm say today? So to guide us in this, we have Alex Kronemer, co-founder of UPF. And he's going to introduce our esteemed panel of scholars and biographers and professors. So with that said, I invite our panelists to join, to turn their video on. There they are. And Alex, please take it away.
Hello everyone, assalamu alaikum and shalom and peace to all of you who have joined. My name is Alex Kronemer. I am the co-founder of Unity Productions Foundation along with Michael Wolf and the executive producer for most of our films. As Daniel said, since the advent of the COVID crisis, we've been trying to create activities for all of us who are locked in there inside, doing numerous webinars on many topics. And we wanted tonight to do a discussion on a very, obviously one of the most important things to arise since COVID, which is the Black Lives Matter protests that have happened in the wake of the terrible murder of George Floyd and the cry for, finally racial equality and the end of police brutality. And as we were thinking about that topic, came across a video of Malcolm X, I don't know, 30 or 40 years ago, whenever it was that he recorded it, using exactly the words, you're on our necks, we can't breathe. And I personally was very struck by just being reminded of that cry that has been happening now for many, many decades, in fact, hundreds of years. And so we wanted to do a discussion tonight about Malcolm X, his legacy, and his relevance in the context of the things that are going on today. We are doing this on Zoom, as we have all of them. Please be patient with any technical difficulties we may encounter. You'll see Daniel Tutt, his face is there. There's a person named Jennifer Goldson, her name. She's going to be working in the background, fielding questions and sending them to my way as we are doing the discussion. So let me begin with some introductions of who we have with us tonight. First of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Aminah McCloud. She is Professor Emerita of Religious Studies and the former director of the Islamic World Studies program at DePaul University. Her areas of expertise include Islam in America, Muslim women, Islamic studies, and the history, geography, politics, religion, and philosophy of Islam. She is the author and co-author of several books, including African American Islam, Questions of Faith, published in 1999, Transnational Muslims in American Society in 2006, and most recently in 2013, An Introduction to Islam in the 21st Century. She is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Islamic Law and Culture and a member, I believe still a member of the Board of Advisors for the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. We also have with us Zaheer Ali, a very accomplished young man. I'm actually a little jealous of everything you've done, Zaheer. He's an oral historian and an educator who for nearly 2 decades has worked as a listener, an amplifier, and a preserver of stories of often marginalized voices. he served as the project manager of Columbia University's Malcolm X project under the direction of the late Manning Marable. And he was the lead, Zaheer was the lead researcher for Marable's Pulitzer Prize winning biography, Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention. As a scholar of Malcolm X, he has written for both scholarly and general publics, and has been a featured narrator and commentator in 2 documentaries about Malcolm X. And finally, we have with us Imam Mendes, Adeyinka Mendes. He is a resident scholar and imam at the Muslim Center of Greater Princeton, New Jersey, and the co-founder and lead instructor of the Garden of Knowledge Academy for Arabic and Islamic Studies. He also established the African American Healing Ancestry Development Collective and the soon-to-be launched Bilal Spiritual Center for Peace, the Arts, and Consciousness, something I think we all agree we need. He currently works for environmental justice and women's empowerment in religious spaces, as well as building bridges of understanding and cooperation between peoples of different faiths and cultures. So welcome all of you. What a great panel you all make. I mean, so much expertise, so much knowledge here, and so let's get right into it. As I said, my own interest in this idea of focusing specifically on Malcolm X came when, in a Facebook post, I saw an excerpt of Malcolm saying, get off our necks, we can't breathe. And it just it kind of broke my heart, actually, to know that has being said, not just in the last few years of some of the actions that we've seen live taken against African Americans, but has been being said for, again, as I said, for centuries. So let's start with you, Zaheer, and just ask, what do you think Malcolm X would say or do in this moment that we are experiencing?
Well, first of all, thank you for convening this conversation. I'm looking forward to it. That question is a question I like to challenge us about. I call it historical ventriloquism, where we attempt to put our words in the mouths of historical figures and have them speak for us. History, of course, is really important. I'm a historian. I understand the importance of studying history. But I think when we approach this by asking what would Malcolm say, we are relinquishing our responsibility for doing the critical, thoughtful analysis that we have to do about today. So I like to flip the question around, as opposed to, rather than asking what would Malcolm say to us today, think about what we would say to Malcolm. What questions would Malcolm's history and legacy pose to us that we must answer, not just as individuals, but as communities, and certainly as a society. And that draws in, all of the issues that Malcolm, of course, worked on and struggled against, including police brutality. There were several instances in his own history where he mobilized people to protest and challenge police brutality in the streets, in the mosque, or not police brutality in the mosque, but police brutality against people in the mosque. He utilized the court system, he utilized the newspapers. And so there's a lot that we can learn from his history. But in terms of what Malcolm would say to us today, I'm more interested in what we have to say in light of the questions that Malcolm posed in his lifetime.
So Imam Mendes, what is it that we would say?
I would agree with Zaheer. And again, once again, thank you for having us. This is a conversation, I think it's very timely and necessary. But yeah, I would agree with Zaheer. I think it's a bit disingenuous, maybe intellectually lazy, to ask what would Malcolm say, because we don't know what he would say. Every human being is evolving. Malcolm at 27 was not Malcolm at 39, even in his thought. And so I think what's really important is to understand how we are responding to our situation, and not to use Malcolm to mask or even to magnify, to use his iconic personality to magnify our efforts, but to be in conversation with him. And that will lead us to deeper truth and knowledge.
How do we have a conversation?
Well, it begins with knowing something about the man and his teachings and, you know, his work, his legacy, and those that have continued that legacy after him. It begins with us, you know, really responding to our environment, to the issues of our time, and then, you know, looking inward, right? Looking inward and measuring our actions and looking at how we succeed and how we stumble and get back up, compared to how Malcolm lived his own principles. Not to compare or measure or validate ourselves through him, but really to use him as a mirror.
Now, before I ask your opinion, Dr. McCloud, I have to begin by telling our audience that you insisted that I not call you Dr. McCloud, but call you Aminah. So that's what I will do, only because you're insisting that I do that. So tell us, what are your thoughts on this subject, on this question?
Well, again, as with my colleagues, thank you very much for convening this and for asking me. I'm listening and I'm learning a lot from Yinka and Zaheer, because in one way, they have a male reading of Malcolm. I have a different reading of the autobiography and of his life, but collectively, I think we lose understanding Islam as performative in one way, in a very practical, everyday way, and we miss how the faith tradition informs, transforms, and calls upon us to act in certain ways, which I think that Malcolm he was an example of. We have, you know, lots of accoutrements in Islam, especially African Americans, as they seek to figure out this quote unquote Muslim thing, which is why I use the word transitioning, because you're always in transition. You're always evolving and maturing as to how you see and place things. So just as they were talking about Malcolm is not at 39 who he was at 27, Islamically, he's not that either. But the texts that I read don't interrogate the questions he's asking of himself nor of us spiritually. And I think that that is very, very important, because we're one of the younger communities in the world who have engaged Islam as our way of life. We can't mimic Islam somewhere else because that's not our history, perhaps. You know, the languages of Islam expand as the people who engage it expand. And what we've kind of tried to do, and Malcolm was very adamant about, he has to speak to the people in the language that they understand, that conveys their experiences. And his discipline, being enraged at a condition, but not enraged, so that the use of rhetorical analysis and the logical ways of thinking could not come through, is very, very important.
So you've said two really interesting things. You've raised the issue of his spirituality, which I want to get into in a moment. But before that, you said a very interesting comment that as a woman, you see his story differently, perhaps, than a man might see it. And, you know, keeping in mind that Alex Haley, a man, wrote the story from a man's point of view about Malcolm X. Tell us about, you know, you as a woman, how do you see the story maybe differently than myself as a man might?
Well, I think, you know, lots of people, black, white, brown, have read the autobiography of Malcolm X. Whether they've interrogated the story or not, I can't say. But it is written by Alex Haley, a man's story. Women are there. You know they're there. You can smell them, touch them, feel them. But their stories and how, because nobody grows alone. You know, the roots have to go somewhere. And you don't get the sense of how the women in his life are forming, nurturing, shaping, and molding him in certain ways. You have to infer, you know, it's not there. And even when you go to the videos, the men who are doing a version of a movie, the women are minimized. They have little snapshots here and there. They're minimized because the focus is on the male. But like when you opened up, George Floyd epitomized a certain kind of action of one who thought they were human against someone that they did not think were human. But almost simultaneously, Breonna Taylor is murdered through her door, and she becomes secondary to the narrative. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do.
If we look widely at the movements today, whether we're talking about Muslim art or Black Lives Matter or Sapelo Square, they're all led by women of color. So that in and of itself says, and they're supported by men.
Yeah.
You know? So it's not an either or, which is the way we're kind of forced to think of things, you know. If it had been Breonna Taylor, who had been slapped to the ground and handcuffs put on, like a couple of women were a few days later, and the officer had put his knee on her neck, would that have changed the narrative?
Interesting. That's a very fascinating point. Imam Mendes, you know, in your introduction, I mentioned how you work for women's empowerment. So I'd be interested to know, and actually I'll ask you too, Zaheer, after him, but what do you think about this idea? Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I think that Malcolm can be read many different ways, and we all bring all of ourselves. You know, I'm more than a man, right? I'm not just a Muslim. I'm not just African American. When I read anything, I bring my entire experience, and Malcolm requires you bringing everything. He has so many layers, and there's so many angles and so many perspectives to his life. I do agree to an extent with Aminah, but I would say that there are. I'm trying.
I hear you.
Look, I was
We're
raised.
having a hard time with that. You know, you set us up.
I was raised in the South, and that's taboo, right? It's taboo. So I'm trying to call you Aminah. So anyway, but you know, I think I do agree with her to an extent. Most of the narratives around Malcolm's life are very male-centric, but there's one personality who just shine. You can't make her invisible, and that's Ella Collins, right? We see him guided by her every major step of the way in his transformation throughout his life. And there's a book I have right next to me, written by her son, his nephew, a seventh child, that I really encourage people to get, because it's called Seventh Child, and it's by Rodnell Collins, who's the son of Ella Collins, and it's really his take through his mother's eyes on the life of Malcolm. And like Aminah saying, it's a different story, right? And it's a richer story, I think, much richer story.
Zaheer, you're the scholar of Malcolm X. Tell our audience a little bit about who Ella Collins was and the role she played in Malcolm's life.
Sure. Ella Collins was his half-sister, who Malcolm went to live with in Boston when he left his family, when he left the foster family that he was living with. And he went to visit her and ended up living with her. And so he lived with her during what is called the Detroit Red phase of Malcolm's life, when Malcolm is coming into adulthood, exploring, you know, Black culture and music and dance and pleasure and underground economy or parallel economy. And later in life, it is Ella who actually gives him the money to make the Hajj. This is someone who was always in his corner and who always tried to guide and support Malcolm. And so as Shaykh Mendes says, like, this is an important figure. And I think, Aminah certainly, and I hate calling you Aminah. Dr. McCloud might slip through my mouth at some point, but her work on the history of the experiences of African American women in Islam in North America is pioneering. There are other people who have kind of built on her work, like Jamila Kareem, who's done work on women in the Nation of Islam, or Eula Taylor, who just did a really important book about how women navigated patriarchy in these communities. And until we get more of those kinds of stories surfacing, the story of Islam in America is very male-centered, right? It's Noble Drew Ali, then it's like Elijah Muhammad, and it's Malcolm X, and it's Muhammad Ali, and it's Imam W.D. Muhammad, and it's Jamil El-Amin, like it's all this string of men. And so, that's why we do need to make sure we call out and explicitly name the experiences of women in these communities who were significant. When we look at Malcolm's experience with this issue of police brutality, which is one of the reasons why it's important to look at this history, is that this is not new. These are not isolated incidents. This is a systemic structural problem that has existed, we could argue, since the beginning of this nation with the enslavement.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah.
Only because I think it's important for our audience to understand what is meant by systemic.
Well, when I say systemic, I mean something that is rooted as part of the politics and practices of the United States government in the national, federal, state, and local levels. That this is not, this is baked in the cake. This is not just the icing on the cake. This is baked in the cake. It is a fundamental part of the United States. And so that's why, treating the value, of course, of singling out a George Floyd or even a Breonna Taylor is that the personal stories help give a human face and body to the terror that is visited upon Black communities. The challenge when we individualize these stories, though, is that we lose sight of this being a broader problem. And in Malcolm's own history, he encountered, this issue. And there are two really dramatic incidents. One is in 1957, when the police in Harlem beat up a member of the Nation of Islam's Mosque number 7, Johnson Hinton, and Malcolm mobilized the Fruit of Islam, stationed them outside the police precinct until the police released that brother to get medical attention. There is another important incident in 1962 where police attack the members of the Nation of Islam's Mosque number 27 in Los Angeles and shoot, I think, a half a dozen of them and kill one of them. And Malcolm goes out to LA to mobilize a coalition to within the community against this issue of police brutality. What's interesting, though, is that there are other incidents where that illustrate the police attacking not Muslim men, but Muslim women. In fact, in 1957, before that Johnson Hinton case in Harlem, there were 2 Muslim women in Alabama who were traveling to Chicago for the Nation of Islam's annual convention. And in the train station in Alabama, they sat on a whites-only bench. And the police sought to remove them from the bench. And if you understand anything about Muslim culture of self-defense, there was a fight that ensued. And Malcolm actually had to go down to Alabama to help negotiate the release of the believers who got into that altercation. And then later in I think 1958, there were police who tried to, and in fact invaded the home that Malcolm lived in East Elmhurst, Queens, While he wasn't there, his wife and some other members were in that home. And the women, including Dr. Betty, well, at the time she wasn't doctor, but Dr. Betty Shabazz, took them all out and lined them up in the driveway before arresting them. And so, you know, to Aminah's point about what stories do we raise up and what stories do we learn, do we know about, it's important for us to understand that the issue of police brutality against not just Black people, Black men, Black women, Black Muslim men, Black Muslim women is something that Malcolm organized against, that he campaigned against, that he tried to fight in the courts, in the streets, with protests, with rallies. And you know, it goes, and I just, one more thing about this is that these attacks on these various incidents, these people were attacked not just because they were Black, but because they were Black and Muslim. And so I think it's really important. You know, Malcolm, of course, gives this important speech in LA in 1962 that says, you know, we're brutalized because we're Black, not because we're Methodist, not because we're Muslim, not because we're Catholic, but because we're Black. And that was his plea for people to understand the common thread. But it's important to know and note that not only did police brutalize Black people in the 1960s, but they also targeted, through physical violence, but also through the violence of surveillance, Black Muslim communities. And so that's when we're talking about Malcolm's legacy for us understanding this current moment. I think it's important for us to understand that there's an inheritance as Black people, and then there's an inheritance as Muslims in the United States that we have to carry.
You know, wow, there's so much in what you just shared. I want to actually begin to move on to the topic of spirituality and religion, but I think that for me, at least, you know, I mean, I'm learning a lot, not just from this conversation, but from everything that's been happening.
Can I just add, Alex, before we transition? You know, you asked me about my work as an imam and the empowerment of women in religious spaces. I think that when we look at Malcolm's legacy, this is something that, especially in his last interview that he gave a few weeks before he was assassinated, he emphasized and impressed upon Muslims in the United States and around the world to take the centering of women very seriously. And I think the more our mosques, our Islamic centers, our schools are guided, not just by men, but are led and guided by women with all their talents and their gifts and their power and their beauty and their intelligence, we'll see a community that looks more like the community that Malcolm hoped his children and his offspring would grow up in.
Yeah, you know, I think like you know, we began with Zaheer talking about, you know, not to put words in Malcolm's mouth, but that maybe ask questions of him or wonder what his questions would be of us. And I think, Aminah, we can summarize what we've just been discussing up until now with the question of, you know, if it had been a woman, would this have happened? And if not, a woman who was killed. And if not, you know, I think all of us need to be reflective of many aspects of this and the dimension of women in the story. You know, half my family is Egyptian. My wife's side of the family is Egyptian. And, you know, we watched those 10 years ago or so when the revolution was happening there, which ultimately failed. And, you know, one of the things that I've learned both from discussions with family members of hers, but also reporting, is that women ultimately were pushed out of it. You know, it became a male-only event, and I wonder to what degree the Arab uprising.
Lead the women, you'd have been all right.
Yeah, so I think this whole issue of
I agree with that. Yeah, I agree.
The role of women in all this is really a crucial one. But we also I want to move on because there's so many important points for us to touch on, and all of you have already spoke a little bit to this notion of Malcolm's spirituality and his religion. And I think of all the magnificent documentaries and movies that have been made about Malcolm X, the deficiency that runs through most of them is they treat him as entirely a political figure.
Right.
Yeah.
And never as a man who was deeply religious and spiritual. And I think, and it's an important discussion for us to have right now about his spirituality and his religion and how that influenced and shaped him and his development. And let's start with you with your reflections on that.
Well, I think, and I've thought about this a lot. We have, not to cast aspersions, but we have a dress of Islam.
I have what?
A dress.
A dress. Mm-hmm.
Purely superficial. You say the right things at the appropriate time. You have the right adab. You do things in a particular way. You socially distance. Muslims are good at social distancing. You act in a certain way about some things about worship, things about gender relations. And if you do those things, you can ignore everything else that's in the Quran. You don't have to show gratitude. You don't have to seek mercy. You don't have to take the stories, back to what Zaheer was saying, you don't have to take the stories and extract from them what is important today. But what happens for Malcolm is he, I think, would ask us, haven't you learned yet? We've done the trans-historical ventriloquism. I love that phrase.
That's right.
The trans-historical ventriloquism. We're digging up old dead Arab men, old dead South Asian men. They're all men, and we're digging them up
All the day and all night.
all the time.
Yeah.
And as if they didn't live in a space and time with its own problems that they had to handle with the best of intentions. Now, granted, most of them probably had to consult their wives to figure out what to say, but sometimes that's good, but it's better to listen to that other course that we've been given here by Zaheer, is what would those men say today? How did you take a message and live it, embody it, and move on it? I think Malcolm would see the engagement in the streets of one aspect of what we are all calling systemic. And he would ask us, don't you yet see the system? Stop attacking the forelegs of the spider, leaving the middle parts alone and the back legs flapping in the wind. Because by the time you get to them, then the forelegs will have recouped and regenerated. So I think he would ask us, as he moves in his life and time from the local to the global, didn't you hear me?
So do we hear him? Zaheer, what do you think about the spiritual and religious dimensions of Malcolm?
So I definitely think we have, and generally people have not been able to take seriously Malcolm's spiritual history and legacy. I am also at the same time challenged in wanting to accept the division between the political and the spiritual. I think, speaking out against the brutality of the state against its citizens is as much a spiritual act of affirming the dignity and protection of human life as it is a political one. I think, going out to protest is a sacred ritual. I think, there are ways that I think the work that people do politically is spiritual. And then if you look at the more broader definition of civic religion or civil religion that someone like Robert Bellah talked about, what are the kind of public civic performances of ritual and deep meaning that are needed to hold a community together. I think I think Malcolm served that purpose, and Malcolm was and I use this term in the kind of Western intellectual concept of prophetic, not to get me in trouble with you know, people who are like, oh, you're calling him a prophet. No, he was prophetic in the sense that he was able to speak drawn from a spiritual tradition and speak critically about what was happening in the society. That is spiritual. I don't need to see Malcolm doing rakas to know that Malcolm was spiritual. I don't need to know that Malcolm, you know, and he did get up in the morning for prayer, and we know he did fast, but I don't need to know that he did that in order to know that he practiced in his politics a reflection of dignity of human life and upholding and defending the dignity of human life that is at the core of his spiritual tradition. If you have spirituality that does not lead you to speak out against the killing of people and the killing in this country of Black people, your spirituality doesn't exist.
Yeah, I would agree.
Shaykh Mendes, I'm going to ask you questions, maybe a little personal, maybe it's a little unfair. So if it is, just stop me. But you, in your public researching you publicly, it talks about how you converted to Islam as a teenager. And I wonder, and I vaguely recall that the autobiography is a little bit mixed in with that story. Did Malcolm X, his story, anything about his religiosity or spirituality, as we've been discussing, influence you in that, you know, moving towards Islam, becoming a convert to the religion? Or, and if not, that's okay. I don't want to put you on the spot there, but it would be interesting to know how it might have impacted. What's that? Put him on the spot? Don't tell everybody.
Okay.
Well, yeah, that question is welcomed. I thank you for that question. First of all, I don't see myself in any way as a convert. I don't use the word convert. I don't use the revert word either. You know, when God speaks about people embracing the faith in the Quran, he uses the word entering into Islam. Right? And so I see myself as a seeker of truth, as Malcolm was, who was on a journey seeking universal wisdom and ultimate truth. And to answer your question specifically, absolutely. Malcolm's journey was an inspiration for me when I was, you know, a 17-year-old, you know, young man deciding, am I going to take this new spiritual path? Or am I going to stay in the religious tradition I was born into with the conflicts, you know, the intellectual and theological conundrums I was wrestling with as a 17-year-old after my trip to Jerusalem. And so, you know, Malcolm's commitment to truth seeking, Malcolm's commitment to spiritual transformation had a lot to do with my own decision. It wasn't the only thing. But, you know, I think that there's a book I have. It's about to be published soon. It's originally in Turkish. It's by Dr. Rajab Sinturk, who many of you probably know. He's based in Istanbul, and he wrote this amazing book on Malcolm X called Malcolm X, The Struggle for Human Rights. And what he does, and it's his best-selling book. Out of all the books he's written in the Turkish language in Turkey, it's its best book. It's in its 9th edition, at least. And what he does is he gives a spiritual biography of Malcolm X. And he frames his life within the context of his spiritual evolution through the 7 degrees of the soul that we know about from the Quran, from the lowest level of the soul when he was in his, as Zaheer said, his Detroit Red phase, to the highest levels of the soul, where at the end of his life, even though when he went to Ghana, when he went to Egypt, when he went to, you know, countries in Europe, people were begging him, don't go back to the United States. But he made the choice to come back, to offer his life, to offer his energy for the liberation, for the awakening of so many that were living in his time and that were yet to come. And so I agree with my colleagues. Malcolm was the embodiment of a spirituality that was so much deeper than rituals. You know, we perform the rituals, we pray, we fast, we give charity, so that we can cultivate the courage to speak truth to power when necessary. And Malcolm embodied that. And you see in him the kind of Muslim that does not separate his socio-political engagement from his spirituality and religious devotion. In fact, they were one and the same. One enriched the other. And that's really the kind of life that I sought and that I'm still seeking.
That's thank you for sharing that. That's actually
You're welcome.
very there's a lot to think about in that, and it's also very personal, so I appreciate you sharing that. You know, it makes me, though you almost answered my question at the very end, but it makes me wonder, it feels so much like we look, particularly in a moment like we're in right now, we look at Malcolm, the political person, the nationalist person, for guidance, for inspiration. And I'm wondering, I'm just making a list as we're going along, the questions that Malcolm might ask of us. I'm wondering if we should be rather in this moment looking at his spiritual or religious self, his religious dimension, and would there be a difference? What do you think?
I would say not rather, but also.
But also.
Yeah.
But I want to make it rather, in the sense that also is not challenging to people who exclusively look at the political. Okay, also yes, but I'm still focusing on the guy who makes the speeches, the guy who's he was. If we had to put that aside and look just at the religious, just like the spiritual, is there what are the questions? I hear you messing me up. I keep wanting to say what he would say to us. You've told me I can't say that. So
no, we can.
I'm trying to phrase the questions right. What would he say to us about that?
What it is, Alex, you have to be a good student. You need to change your language. Gotten you away from convert into, in Islam, you move through stages.
Yes.
So at best, you're transitioning. You're not doing the Christian thing of having whatever that dude's name was, Epiphany somewhere. You're not doing that. So now we're going to reverse our questions.
Okay.
Right? Get your notebook out, start it.
All right.
What would you ask of us?
So
and
I,
it's hard because it's easier to play pretend. You know what I'm saying? To do that trans-historical thing is easy. Yeah. It's harder to answer his questions to us.
Right. So what would be his questions to us?
To frame your question, and I think I would think about it this way: for people who are most active in what we understand to be political work, what are your spiritual groundings? That's what I think his legacy asks of us. And for people who are in religious centers, in religious communities, and I really want to lean on this question because of this forum, right? This context is about Malcolm X and Black Lives Matter, and it's convened by a group that focuses on Muslim media, right? So I'm less interested in interrogating the spiritual foundations of today's political actors as I am in asking us, and the people who consider themselves spiritual workers, however, or practice, whatever you call yourself as a religious person, what are your political commitments? How does, Cornel West says, justice is love.
Radical love.
Love in public practice is justice, right? So what is the public practice of your Islam look like, right? That's the question that I think Malcolm's legacy forces us to answer, because you know what? Malcolm was out. The reason why we know Malcolm is because he was out there. He did not practice a privatized, spiritualized, in the masjid Islam. He practiced an Islam that was public, that was publicly engaged, and that challenged the politics of his time. And so the question Malcolm's legacy poses to us, who consider ourselves religious people, whatever degree of religiosity we say we have, if we're talking to a Muslim audience, what is your spiritual commitment, right? And Malcolm, and I think Sheikh Mendes referred to his final interview. He had this question and answer with a publication from the Islamic Center in Switzerland. The magazine was called Al-Muslimun, and it was led by Saeed Ramadan at the time. And they had sent him a list of questions that he sat down to answer in the final week of his life. And one of the things they asked him about was his continued commitment to Black people. And they felt that that was problematic because they were like, you know, you're supposed to be the universal Muslim. How can you be so specifically committed to Black people? And he answered that question. And I think in his answer is a question to us. So I'm going to ask that specific question, not just what is your political commitment as Muslims? What is your commitment to eradicating racial injustice and inequity, and specifically anti-Blackness in the United States and in your own communities? That is the question I think Malcolm would pose to us.
Well, you know, I think that one beginning answer is without a notion of how one lives that spiritual life, how they, you know, because you got to have some seating in order to stand for anything. So I think many of us have become overwhelmed, but let me for a minute speak as a female. And that is the women that you see out there, the young, you know, my children, my girl children out there leading these moments, find themselves in the same way that the women who are my age found themselves. And that is, you're alone. If you're a Muslim woman, there's a place for you. And Sheikh Mendes, I'll call you Yinka because you're a kid to me.
Thank you.
You don't have to empower me, trust me. I think that it is learning how to balance the natural voice, because we raised you guys, you know, it's finding a way to balance what is our natural voice to let you mature, you know, and that is difficult. Inside of the Muslim community, when I looked out in the street, I saw the young women march. It takes a hell of a lot of courage to get out there not knowing if you're going to be shot, knocked down, whether you're in Egypt, in Cairo, or you're on the streets of Minneapolis, right? It takes a lot of courage, but it also takes, what if you can't pray? What if you can't put on all these clothes the men have decided to dress you in? You know, and I'm always remembering those young women in Saudi Arabia who were sleeping and a fire breaks out. The men mandate, oh, you got to be dressed when you go, so I'm going to send you back to die. Lots of things are happening where if we don't get a picture of the whole spider, we're always attacking the legs, you know, and we're attacking them in twos, you know, spiders with the leg segments. You know,
right.
Miss the other segments. Malcolm's autobiography affected people worldwide. Everybody read it differently. The questions, I think, in some way comes back to the fundamental question that Zaheer just asked. If you're going to claim, one woman said, Muslims don't go into the streets to seek justice. And my answer was, well, what bubble is she living in, on which planet? You know, because I really hope she stays there. But you don't go into the streets to seek justice. We have to take into consideration those among us, because Black people are not a monolith. We come from the Caribbean, we come from South America, we come from Cuba, we come from lots of different places. And our experiences of the knee on the neck, sometimes, the shades of difference. Same knee, same neck, but shades of difference as to how the knee got on the neck kind of wants to condition our response. But then the imams, sheikhs, since, women don't get to be any of those things without a great deal of struggle, are in the masjid. I remember the first day of the protest, the first Friday, many of the imams, people were out in the streets. One imam gave a khutbah on wudu, how to wash. Another one talked about something, he was extolling the blessings and something or the other of Ramadan. I'm not saying that you don't do that, but I'm saying, when are you going to get the news to the people? When, the book is there, you got the book, make the book work for you, and if it's not working for you, then you better reassess. And many times, and this is just a disclosure, you look out there at the Muslim community, and especially if you've been Muslim as long as I have, and you say, oh my goodness, why couldn't you have converted to Buddhism? That's a nice, quiet, and then I realized that the Buddhists were killing people, and so that didn't work. So I'm at a loss as to where I can put people, how they can open the Quran, and it doesn't say you only give your zakat to Muslims. It's a wide palette there. I don't know what they're reading. Maybe I just, out of the 30 or 40 Qurans I have, I'm misreading.
Yeah, I would just say, Aminah, no, that imams and sheikhs are not a monolith either. There are many imams and sheikhs that I'm in conversation with on a daily basis who gave sermons and are giving lectures and writing books about the not just the importance of demonstrating and protesting and civil disobedience when necessary, but the obligation, the spiritual and religious obligation of doing so. And they gave khutbahs throughout Ramadan. They gave khutbahs after the murder of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd on the same issues you're talking about. So I think it's important for us not to generalize. There are voices out there in our mosques, in our Islamic centers, who share your sentiment.
I know, yeah. I am glad to hear.
Yeah, who share your sentiment and
louder.
And second, those voices are often not the ones that get the most attention, right? Yeah. But then also, I agree with you. There's no man can empower a woman. And I never said that I empowered women. I did say I was passionate. I was passionate.
I said that.
Okay, that's no.
I have to take the blame for that, Aminah. He said in his he was passionate about it.
A woman is empowered through her relationship with Allah, with God,
exactly.
Through her connection to the sacred feminine.
Yeah.
That's within her. And all men need to do is, move out the way. Move out the way.
So I want to, first of all, we're getting some questions. Let me just tell our audience, if you're watching on Facebook or through Zoom, we're going to be on for another about 20 minutes. So if you want to send any questions in, now is the time. So I'm going to, first of all, pose a question that I don't want you to answer yet, because I want to give everybody in the audience, because we've got like 10 of these. I want to give everyone in the audience time to get their pencils so you can reflect on it. But I'm going to ask you in about 5 minutes, besides the autobiography of Malcolm X, give us a book recommendation that you would recommend for people who want to know more about some of the topics we've been discussing about his story, or two. So think about what that is, and we're going to let the people in the audience get their pens and papers ready so they can jot that down. But before we do that, I've been jotting down the questions that Malcolm X might be asking of us. I have about 4, and I just want to state them, and I would like for you all to comment or correct me or elaborate on any of them that you see fit. You know, I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I approach, and as such, I approach everything as a student. I always tell, you know, it always surprises people, but I try to know as little about the topics that I want to cover as possible. Because I feel like when I know very little, those things that jump out at me, the questions that jump out at me, I'm kind of the audience surrogate. Those are the things that are going to jump out or interest an audience that knows very little too. And if I know too much, then, you know, I start thinking at different levels and I get argumentative, and I don't want to do that. So as a student of this conversation, these are the questions that from all of you that I'm imagining Malcolm X, I'm hearing Malcolm X asking, and I, again, would like your commentary, correction, or elaboration on any of them. So first of all, you know, what is your spiritual commitment? You know, how do you publicly practice? Now, publicly practice, not meaning publicly praying, publicly dressing, as I understand it, but really being a part of those deeper issues of justice, of freedom, of compassion, of mercy. How do you practice that? That's one question. The second question is, do you recognize the role of women in my life, meaning Malcolm's life, and also the role of women in this moment that we're living right now? I think it's going to come as a surprise to many people in this audience, in our audience, and I'll say that because I myself only learned this a few days ago, or was made aware of it, let's say. And I was surprised to know that women are the starters of the Black Lives Matters movement and so many of these other movements. So do we know that? And if we don't, why don't you? We've been talking a little bit about, I wrote it down here, historical ventriloquism. In my work as a filmmaker, we call it historical anachronism. And that is imposing thoughts and questions of today on people of the past who never thought or had those questions posed to them, and trying to get answers, trying to squeeze what they're saying into answers. And again, from what I'm hearing some of you say, the question Malcolm might ask is, don't try to do intellectual shortcuts by going to the past, the people who lived hundreds of years ago, who have no idea what today is like. You have to think for today. You have to think for yourself, your way out of it. And finally, I was, you know, watching a television program a few nights ago concerning, you know, all the statues, all the Southern general statues that are being taken down. And the question was, well, what should replace it? And the person who was commenting pointed out something that I probably knew but have never really reflected on, that we tend to think of the great moments of Black leadership being in the last 20 years, you know, Obama and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And this person was pointing out that immediately after the Civil War, there were Black senators and mayors of towns and governors. I mean, you know, during the Reconstruction, there were these great political leaders then. And the issue really is, and what these statues really represented, is the fact that when Reconstruction ended, there was this, you know, this rise again in white supremacy.
Can you describe what Reconstruction is for the audience?
Sure. A Reconstruction being that period immediately following the Civil War, when the southern states were occupied by the northern armies and were kind of against their will in some ways being forced to bring African Americans, recently freed slaves, into society. And many of these recently enslaved people were were great intellects and great leaders and became those things. But very, very shortly after that, when, for various reasons, when the North politics changed, things changed, and the North went out, the whites in the South had a backlash, and through terrorism, Ku Klux Klan, and other ways, you know, all the things we know about Jim Crow and so forth. And it made me, as I'm listening to you all speak, it makes me suddenly think, and again, a question that Malcolm might ask is, have these last 3 years been a period of backlash against the Obama presidency and against what that represented, in the same way that after Reconstruction, there was this rise in white supremacy? And is what's happening right now in the streets the answer that being not this time. You know, is that what this means, or is it going to be a continuation of the backlash? Will this pass and we will see that? So those are the questions that I've heard Malcolm X ask me as I've been listening to all of you speak. And I welcome your comments or thoughts or critiques on any of them or additions. And then we're gonna get to the book recommendations. And any of you can start. Or do I need to pick somebody? You're smiling, Zaheer, so I'll go with you.
You have said, oh, I'm sorry. Go
No,
ahead.
go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Aminah.
Yeah.
No. Age before beauty.
Well, that means you, Zaheer.
I think those are all great questions. And so I'll touch on the spiritual commitment, one of them at least, the spiritual commitment, maybe another. And I do think that there is something to be, and I saw someone comment in the Facebook comments, Matt Burkhold talked about what could Malcolm's story of personal transformation, what could the import of that be for people who are doing movement work, and I do think that that's important, right? Malcolm's humility, Malcolm's discipline, his willingness to submit to new knowledge and new information and new circumstances in order to, revise his ideas. And I think, those are rooted in a spiritual disposition, right? Of humility, that checks the ego, that, Malcolm was not someone who felt like, well, I used to say this and I have to say that forever because that's what I said. He was willing to come before the public and say, well, I've changed my mind. And that requires a spiritual grounding in oneself, and able to be comfortable, to not be swayed by the public in that sense, to kind of listen to that inner voice. I think, we've talked about the role of women. I think that women were critical during Malcolm's history. Malcolm came to even a greater appreciation of the role of women as he created spaces for leadership for women in his organization, especially the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which he founded in 1964. He began listening to activists like Fannie Lou Hamer. He began speaking about and understanding the role of women, especially that he saw amongst the student organizers in SNCC. So Malcolm was moving. He didn't have enough time, of course, for us to see where it went, but he clearly would not be surprised, I think. And we shouldn't be surprised looking at the trajectory of women's leadership in not just the civil rights movement, but the Black freedom movement, broadly speaking. So I guess I'll pause there to see. I mean, I have some other thoughts, but I don't want to take up the time. So I want to let other people respond to some of the questions that you posed.
I think I'm most anxious about, having lived through one of the other iterations. I'm most anxious. I was very, very fortunate by Allah's mercy, to have had Stokely Carmichael as a teacher with Charles Hamilton and lots of other folk. And having been a member of the Panther Party, I think we did a disservice to history in that we didn't expect to be living this long. So there were some very critical things that we did not pass along. And now that we see young people who are our age, just when we signed up to die prematurely or on time, depends on how you look at it, we did not have a chance to reflect on what we learned because we were too traumatized. I know none of us thought we had done enough, but we were too traumatized to actually have the space of reflection to pass on anything, to ask questions, to do anything, but there was an assumption there that it wasn't going to stop. Well, it did. Now, as we snap back, the young people, you know, you want to go out and say, are you really ready for the backlash? No, we were ready to get shot because we were armed. You're not armed. Are you really ready for the potentials of the backlash, and how have you seated yourself spiritually to go? And it's very, very, I hear a lot of questions because it's not just police brutality. That's one leg of the spider. It's housing, it's food justice, it's this, it's education. And Malcolm was very big on education. If you don't deploy that self exertion toward educating yourself, it's lost. Doesn't mean that you should leave the fight and go sit down with a book. But on the other hand, you've got to keep all the things going simultaneously. But I'm waiting for the plans for the next steps, because the other side is strategizing. There's been an uptake in police brutality. There's been an uptake in violence in the Black community. The anxiety levels for us coming, not quite out of, but through the beginnings of a pandemic, into Ramadan, traditions being changed around a little bit, people's not using their common sense and going and, you know, talking to some long and dead buried scholar. Well, what do I do? It's a pandemic and it's Ramadan. And then when they stuck their toe out the door, there was a protest. And they said, oh my God, my psyche can't take much more. So it becomes, but your psyche must. Because you still got to, I think Malcolm would say, what's your next strategy?
Interesting. What would you say about that, Shaykh Mendes?
I would answer, that was a great segue, Aminah. I would answer Malcolm by saying our strategy is to focus on self-purification, because the work of transforming society can't be done without personal transformation. Our strategy...
Say more. I like that.
I would say that the work of transforming society must be done in tandem with your own commitment to your spiritual evolution. The whole path of, you know, self-actualization and self-realization is tied to a human being's transitioning. You know, I love the fact that you use that word, in transitioning from a view that's self-centered, that's selfish, to one that's selfless. Whether you're looking at your own relationship with your own being, or with your family, your community, the institutions that you interact with, or your country or the world. I would tell Malcolm that our strategy is self-defense, that we're guarding our souls, but we're also committed to guarding our bodies. You know, and the Black Panthers and the Black Liberation Army and, you know, so many other organizations, that was really a part of their culture, to defend the sanctity of life.
Yeah.
All right. I would tell Malcolm that part of our strategy, Alex, is self-sufficiency. Right? Malcolm really saw himself while he was in the nation and afterwards as inspiring the building of a nation, of being a catalyst for the building of a nation that didn't have to beg for freedom. Freedom was the default because our economics, our politics, our food, our drink, our shelter, we were on a path of providing those for ourselves. And then lastly, I would say that our strategy is self-determination, that we have the supreme right and to exercise our choice to define who we are, and what we stand for, and how we will garner the resources needed to realize our greatest potential as human beings, which was at the center of who Malcolm became. he was concerned not just with police brutality, not just with racism, not just with the issues of, poverty and militarism. He was concerned about human rights. He said, I am for truth no matter who tells it, and I'm for justice no matter who it's for or against. I am for what benefits human beings, and I'm paraphrasing. So human rights, he placed that at the center, and I think it's important in our conversation with Malcolm to say to him, Malcolm, we are not going to make Black Lives Matter just the Black Lives Matter movement just about defunding the police, or just about reforming the police, or just about racial justice, or just about Bernie Sanders and the making sure that the income and the power of the 1% is decentralized and redistributed, and there's equity. It's so much more than that. And Malcolm stands for what keeps coming to my mind. I'll end with this. What keeps coming to my mind is this Muslim proverb that every generation has a pharaoh. And that's no disrespect to our brothers and sisters from Egypt. We know every pharaoh was not a tyrant, but the archetypal pharaoh in the Quran was every generation has a pharaoh, and every pharaoh has a Moses. And so the spiritual commitment is for each and every one of us to rise, as Moses did, even with our self-doubt, with our insecurities, even with our lack of religiosity, to rise to this occasion and to tell Pharaoh, let my people go, but then to also tell, as this old Black spiritual says, tell, O Pharaoh, let my people go, but to also tell the Israelites of our time, the Bani Israel of our time, let Pharaoh go.
Wow. I would like to ask you all if we can do a part 2 of this at some point. This is, and there's so many questions that I'll just come in. We're really running out of time. We're not going to really be able to get to many of them. I might tell all of you though, there's been very many very nice comments made about each of you and what you've been saying. So you should know that you've been connecting in a very important way with this audience. We're gonna do one more big question to end it with, but before we do that, I think our audience who wanted, there's several more. There's another question about a book. So all the audience members who want a book recommendation, why don't each of you give your 1 or 2 book recommendations about Malcolm that you think would enhance their understanding of this conversation we're having. Zaheer, we'll start with you.
I guess I'll recommend 2 books. One is by Eula Taylor called The Promise of Patriarchy, which really looks at the experiences of African-American Muslim women in the Nation of Islam, going into the archives and really finding the voices of women themselves to speak about their experiences in that movement. And the other is specific to our topic for today, is a book by a good colleague and friend of mine named Garrett Felber called Those Who Know Don't Say, The Nation of Islam, the Black Freedom Movement and the Carceral State, which looks at the role of the Nation of Islam in challenging incarceration, both within the prison system and outside of it. It is a history that includes Malcolm, of course, but it is a history that is often overlooked when people talk about the Nation of Islam as a sort of nationalist separatist movement that was not somehow engaged in a bigger struggle that it actually was. And so those would be the 2 books that—
Tell us, audience, one last time, what are the 2 titles again? The first one is called?
Eula Taylor is the author, and it's called The Promise of Patriarchy.
The Promise of Patriarchy, and the second one is?
The second one is Those Who Know Don't Say, The Nation of Islam, the Black Freedom Movement, and the Carceral State by Garrett Felber.
So if you just type into Amazon, Those Who Know Don't Say, it'll pop up. Okay, thank you. Shaykh Mendes.
I would recommend the following 2 books. The first is There Is a River by the late historian Vincent Harding. It tracks the unbroken chain of Black freedom struggle, the freedom, the struggle of Black people in America for the freedom of human beings. And Malcolm is part of this continuum, right? And I think it really, contextualizes who he is and what he represents in the larger picture of the Black freedom struggle, again, for humanity, not just Black freedom. It's not a struggle that's just for this to serve the interests of Black people, but it's really about human liberation, the freedom of the human spirit. The second book, and really, I think this is my favorite book about Malcolm. Allah have mercy on him, rahmatullah alayhi. It's called On the Side of My People by Louis DeCaro Jr. And it was the first book-length treatment of Malcolm as a religious person. It's his religious, spiritual personality. There are places he went, organizations he worked with, people that he was influenced by, that he influenced, that are not mentioned in the autobiography, not mentioned in any other book that I've read about Malcolm. So I would encourage people to read that. It should be a part of our libraries, On the Side of My People by Louis DeCaro Jr.
So those two books again are On the Side of My People, and the other one was?
There Is a River by Vincent Harding.
I love that title, by the way. There Is a River. Okay, beautiful. Aminah, what would you recommend?
I like what they've already said. I've read those books. I think they're great. Let me do an add-on. I think that it is important. They're two not necessarily well-written books on Betty Shabazz. That you have to read them and smile, but they're there. But and one book I reviewed recently, America's Other Muslims, by Mohammed Fraser Rahim. I think I got the last part right. Which is a very interesting take as he tries to counter the master narrative of the early African-American Muslim communities. I would say, however, to our reading audience, that one of the things that is important is all of us write from a position. And you have to get up the courage to critique what you're reading. You can't just read it and decide. Even the Quran asked us, if you can do it better, try it out. Okay? So we have to learn not to read, and I don't mean critical and I'm looking for something bad. I mean, read between the lines, try to discover our biases, look and see what's being said in the context of when the book was written and what it's talking about.
Wow. That's powerful stuff. Well, we're arriving towards the end. I wanted to let each of you, and as I say, there's been so many great questions come in. We're going to have to do a part 2 of this, I think. One of the questions, though, that maybe you all can address to end our talk with tonight is, it's an interesting question, and it can be taken more than one way. And the question is, where is our Malcolm of today? Is it even possible for there to be a figure like Malcolm X today, or is there not?
You mean one person?
Well, you can take the question however maybe it means the spirit of Malcolm, maybe it means one person. You can take the question as you want, because I'm not entirely sure what it means either. But it's an interesting question maybe to end on, And let's put it. Let's phrase it the way Zaheer taught us to phrase it. Malcolm's asking us. Malcolm's going to ask each of you, "Where am I today?"
Well, I would say that it may not be Malcolm because I don't know the feminine of Malcolm, but it may be in the women who began Black Lives Matter. It may be in Sapelo Square. It may be in Muslim Ark. And I'm not excluding the other places, but I'm saying that it may not be testosterone driven.
You know, and that goes back to one of the questions that Malcolm was asking me as we were going through this, and maybe that's something for us to take away. Don't look just to a man.
Right.
Be the Malcolm today.
And it might be
The Malcolm of today may very well be a woman, probably is.
And it could be more than one.
And it could be more than one, absolutely. Aminah, I want to thank you for just personally, I'm going to go through everybody, but just again, I've known you for years. You know I've been a big fan of your work and of you personally. I've always thought that you're an extremely interesting person, but after some of the things that you said today that I didn't know, you're way more interesting than I even knew, and I'm going to have to talk to you more about
I don't quite know how to take that.
Well, no, I mean that in the best possible way.
In its best sense.
You know, it only can be in its best sense. We're going to go in age order here. So that means you're next, Zaheer. I think. I don't want to make any assumptions.
We're going from the youngest to the oldest.
I'm the oldest. You're next, and now we're going to go to Zaheer. How would you like to respond to that, or anything, or any last words? And by the way, Zaheer, you mentioned all these books, but you didn't mention, out of modesty, perhaps you didn't mention your own book, the one that you participated in, Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention. I do recommend that to your audience, to the audience as well. Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention. It was a Pulitzer Prize winning book, which Zaheer played a central role in putting together. And how would you like to respond to that question, or anything?
Sure. Well, thank you for that. I'm always grateful for the work I was able to do with Manning Marable, and spend about a decade researching Malcolm. So that is something that I'm always grateful for, and of course seeing some of that represented in his book. I'm like Aminah, I think. Well, I think Malcolm himself. I mean, I would have liked to see Malcolm have a conversation with Ella Baker. Ella Baker, who said we need less leader-centered groups and more group-centered leaders.
Wow.
We don't need leadership, we need leaderful. And I think looking for a singular individual, while a singular individual in much of our orientation helps us kind of become mobilized and inspired, and that Messiah complex. But it also, again, allows us to relinquish our responsibility to act for ourselves, to think for ourselves. And I think, Malcolm, looking and thinking of that question, if we look around, there is a leaderful movement. The Malcolm, or versions of Malcolm, and Assata, and Ella Baker, and Fannie Lou Hamer, and Martin King, and the list goes on, are in the founders of Black Lives Matter. They are in the prisons of the United States. They are incarcerated. They are homeless. They are hungry. They are in college. They are in classrooms. They are in the streets. The story of Malcolm that's so powerful is that Malcolm represented potential, human potential, that if channeled and organized and focused and cultivated, could transform not only himself, his community, but the entire nation. And I think that potential exists all around us. It's our responsibility, wherever we are and whatever we do, to take our responsibility to help cultivate that into being.
Wow. Thank you. That actually, that gave me chills. That's amazing, and something I think really worth reflecting on. Shaykh Mendes, before you give your answer, I've gotten a desperate question to you. Would you please repeat the name of the Turkish book about Malcolm that you mentioned earlier?
Right, I was just about to butcher the Turkish for you. I saw the question. I saw the question in the chat. So it's
I don't have Facebook. You know, cheating on the side.
There we go. Well, that's your fault. If you snooze, you lose. Gotta be on Facebook.
No.
Well, we'll give you lessons if you want.
Okay.
What's the name of the book?
So it's in Turkish. It's İnsan Hakları Mücadelesi.
Okay.
It's by Rajab Sinturk. That's spelled RecepSenturk. The upcoming English publication is going to be titled Malcolm X, A Struggle for Human Rights.
Okay, good.
And
Do you know when it's coming?
pardon me?
Do you know when that English version is coming?
Not soon enough. I got the manuscript from a friend of mine who actually translated it. And I guess they're editing it. Maybe they're trying to raise funds.
Probably a year
You
from
gotta share.
Yeah. So we can follow up on that.
And what are your final thoughts as we approach the end of our program?
My final thoughts are in alignment with what Aminah and Zaheer said. I think if we were if it was the year 1927 and we were looking around for the next Martin Delany or the next Frederick Douglass or the next, David Walker or the next Noble Drew Ali, we would miss Malcolm, right? And like Khalil Gibran said, each generation is born for its time.
Right.
And so I don't think asking who's the next Malcolm is the right question. As I said earlier, there's a Muslim proverb, every generation has its pharaoh, and every pharaoh has his or her, right? Because there were queen pharaohs. Thank you, Aminah. Every pharaoh has his or her Moses. And it's really interesting in the Surah Al-Qasas, the 28th chapter of the Quran, when Allah introduces the story of Moses and Pharaoh and his minister Haman and how God's will is connected to the redemption and the upliftment and empowerment of the oppressed. The first person God mentions after that is the mother of Moses, not his father. There's no man. It's the mother of Moses, and the act of courage that she must take on, that she must do, the act of trust in God, of faith, of throwing her son into the river. And so I think Moses is the archetype of what Malcolm embodied. And every generation has many Moseses. We have many Queen Asiyas and, many Khadijas and Mariams. And each of those people, Maryam, Khadija, Fatima, Queen Asiya, the wife of Pharaoh, they each stood up to injustice and to oppressors in their own way. And so that's what we should be doing. We, as parents and as teachers, as religious leaders, as professors, our job is to not get in the way of the blossoming of the Mosaic archetype, of the archetype of Moses that always rises up to speak truth to power. And I'll end with this. The Prophet ﷺ said, God bless him and grant him peace, said that the greatest jihad, the greatest struggle, is a word of truth before an oppressive tyrant. And that's what Malcolm symbolized. So let's not feed fear into our children. Baby, don't do that. I don't want you to get locked up. I don't want you to get, put under surveillance. And, we don't feed our children fear so that they don't respond as Moses would respond, as Malcolm responded, but rather we should feed them courage, trust, faith, all the qualities that God empowered the mother of Moses to express.
Wow. I want to thank all of you. This is really an amazing hour and a half for me, honestly. You give me so many things to reflect on, which I plan on doing. I really hope we can do it again, and I hope everyone in the audience enjoyed it as well. We will be posting this, a recording of today's session for friends or acquaintances of yours who may think should have heard this but weren't on. You'll be able to watch it. Just go to our website, upf.tv. And let me just end, the panelists have been channeling Malcolm X, the whole conversation. The question that keeps going over and over to me is, what is your spiritual commitment and how are you willing to publicly act it out? I think for many of us, who aren't African American. It's very easy sitting on the sidelines right now, supporting it passively or even actively, but avoiding asking our own selves some difficult questions, such as where are the role of women in our mosques, in our churches, in our society? Why don't we think of women first? Why do we think of men first? And also, Martin Luther King once famously said that the most segregated hour in America is during Sunday church. African Americans.
Well, the mosque.
And that was what I was going to add. The mosques are also an extremely segregated place where we don't often see African Americans and immigrant origin Muslims together. So I think everyone in the audience might want to reflect a little bit on that and not just passively observe what's happening, but also take Malcolm's questions in our own lives, in our own communities, and try to make a difference. Thank you all very much. I wish you a great evening, and salams, shalom to the audience.
Shalom.
Peace to everybody.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Shalom aleichem. Thank you, everyone. Namaste.